My name's Eugene Worley, and along with my wife Glenda, we have spent nearly 50 years in ministry in Ethiopia, Norway, the UK, and in the US. I'd like in these podcasts to share with you some of our experiences from those years. Heroes from the past. It's good occasionally to stop and give recognition to those who have paved the way and have gone before you. Africa was once known as the white man's graveyard because so many came and died from yellow fever, malaria, and other tropical diseases. While there's still some who experience these illnesses and even die from them, there are medications that prevent them. In the next few podcasts, I'd like to share the stories of some great men and women who literally gave their lives to bring the gospel to Africa. I believe there are some great lessons we can learn from their lives. The missionary we're featuring today is Robert Moffat. He was born in Scotland in 1795 to a very poor but godly family. They were not able to give him a proper education, so he became an apprentice to a gardener. This would prove to be of great help to him in Africa. He attended classes at night for poor children, and when he came home, his mother read the Bible as well as stories about missionaries. His mother made him promise that he would read the Bible every day, and he did. This, of course, had a great impact on his life. The story is told that while he was still young, he went forward in a service to receive Christ as his Savior. At the end of the year, the deacons discussed whether they should keep their pastor because there were so few results. But one of the deacons reminded them that Robert, or as they called him, Wee Bobby, had been saved. Later, at a missionary meeting that was held in the church, Wee Bobby volunteered to go as a missionary. He did this in a most dramatic way. It was said when the offering plate was passed, he asked the ushers to place the plate on the floor so that he could give himself for the work of the Lord. Like the widow's mite, he gave what he had. Who would have ever known that Wee Bobby would become missionary Robert Moffat and would serve for 50 years in South Africa? Little is much when God is in it. He worked as an apprentice to a godly man in England, and it was then that he met his future wife, Mary Smith. Moffat sailed to South Africa, and 3 years later, Mary joined him, and they were married. They had 10 children, and the oldest daughter, also named Mary, became a missionary. She married David Livingstone. Robert and Mary Moffat served in Africa 23 years before they returned for a furlough. After 4 years, they returned to South Africa and served there until their death. What an amazing story of how a child can make decisions in early life and have such an impact. This reminds me of the story that's found in all 4 Gospels of the feeding of the 5,000. It too revolves around a little boy. Though he's not named, he is pivotal in accomplishing something great. The story is told in John's Gospel of the lad who gave his lunch to Jesus. When Philip asked where they would buy bread to feed all the people, Andrew answered, "There is a lad here which hath 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes, but what are they among so many?" Actually, that's been the story of the gospel since Jesus went back to heaven. God has taken so little to do so much. In this age of church budgets, it is still the widow's mite that pleases God. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 1:27, "But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty." Robert Moffat's family was so poor that no one would have ever thought they would amount to anything. He actually used Moffat's poverty to prepare him for the mission field. Instead of receiving a formal education, he learned more practical skills such as gardening that later was of great help to him in South Africa. Likewise, God never forgot the time that young Robert Moffat put himself in that offering plate because he didn't have any money to give for missions. Did it ever occur to you that God is more interested in you giving yourself than even your money? There are those who are willing to give their money, but not their own hearts and lives. Robert Moffat gave his heart and a lifetime of service. Clearly, Moffat was touched by the needs of the people of South Africa. His compassion is seen in these words, "I have seen in the morning sun the smoke of 1,000 villages where no missionary has ever been." God used this to speak to David Livingstone, who explored much of Africa, looking for those villages to bring the gospel to them. We cannot ignore the need of world missions. While we may be overwhelmed by the need of giving the gospel to over 7 billion people, we must start first by looking at our brother or our neighbor. You see, God's plan is always about people. It goes back to the first book of the Bible when Cain asked the question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Young Robert Moffat at an early age learned that we are indeed our brother's keeper. Though that little church in Scotland didn't have a large budget, nevertheless they helped produce Robert Moffat, which was of far greater value than any amount of money they could have raised for missions. You can't put a monetary value on the life of one person who is willing to dedicate their life for the cause of the gospel. Fred Barlow, in his book Profiles in Evangelism, summarized Moffat's life with these words. He had opened jungle villages to the gospel. He had braved the dangers, the hardships of African jungles. And he had withstood medicine men like Elijah had withstood the prophets of Baal at Carmel. He had preached, he had translated, he instructed Africans to read, write, and sing, and also to farm. He had exalted Christ and magnified the ministry of a missionary. On August 9th, 1883, he wound his watch with a trembling hand. "For the last time," he said. And it was so. The next morning, the 88-year-old soldier of the cross was dead, with 84 years of life for his Lord, since that night as a 4-year-old bairn, as the Scottish would say for child, he had come to Christ. For who hath despised the day of small things? In our next podcast, I will tell the story of David Livingstone, who as a young man was challenged by the reports from Robert Moffat and became one of the greatest missionaries of all time. Please subscribe to our podcast, The Regions Beyond, as we share more stories from the mission field.